A tired traveler knocks on a ranch door for shelter from a storm, but inside, she finds a creepy dinner table with silent men and rattling chains, and the woman in charge offers a choice that could trap her forever. Get ready for a spooky tale of secrets, bravery, and breaking free. The woman in the torn dress stood in the doorway, pointing at something that shouldn't exist. Behind her, in the dim light of the ranch house, 3 men sat perfectly still at a dinner table set for 7. None of them were eating. None of them were speaking. They just waited. "Pick a man, he's yours tonight," the woman said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had said these exact words before, many times, the traveler who had knocked. On the door moments earlier, seeking nothing more than shelter from the approaching storm, stared at the scene that defied explanation. The men at the table wore clean clothes, their faces freshly shaved, but their eyes held the hollow look of people who had forgotten what choice meant. In the corner of the room, partially hidden by shadows, chains rattled softly. Not the chains of a barn or workshop. These were different, heavier, made for something or someone much larger than livestock. The woman smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made the traveler's skin crawl. "The Apache is my finest," she continued, gesturing toward the darkness where those chains sang their metallic song, "though he requires special handling." This was supposed to be a simple ranch, a place where weary travelers could find food and rest. The sign outside had promised hospitality and safety. But as the traveler's eyes adjusted to the strange light filtering through the windows, she began to understand that some promises in this place meant something entirely different. And the most disturbing part, the 3 men at the table had turned to look at her now, their expressions shifting from emptiness to something that looked almost like hope. The storm outside had been nothing compared to the storm brewing in Clarabelle's chest as she stared at the impossible scene before her. 3 men sitting like dolls arranged by a child, their hands folded neatly on a table that gleamed despite the ranch's weathered exterior. The woman who had opened the door stood behind them now, one pale hand resting on the shoulder of the nearest man. He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to breathe. "I don't understand," Clara managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt thick in her throat like swallowing mud. "I just need shelter for the night." My horse threw a shoe about 5 Mary back. The woman's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect for someone living this far from civilization. "Of course you do, dear. That's what they all say." She moved around the table with the grace of someone who had performed this dance countless times before. "But you see, we have rules here. Simple rules that keep everyone content." Clara's eyes darted to the men again. The one closest to her had dark hair and calloused hands that spoke of hard labor. Yet his clothes were pristine, too clean for a working man, too clean for anywhere out here. When she looked closer, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. His wrists bore faint marks, old scars that circled the skin like permanent bracelets. "The rules are quite reasonable," the woman continued, now standing directly in front of Clara. This close, Clara could see that the woman's dress, while well-maintained, had seen better decades. The fabric was expensive, but worn thin in places, like something inherited rather than purchased. "You may stay the night, enjoy a warm meal, rest your bones. All I ask in return is that you choose a companion for the evening." The word companion hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, carrying implications that made Clara's skin crawl. She backed toward the door, her hands searching for the handle behind her, but the woman's voice stopped her cold. "I wouldn't recommend leaving, dear. Not with that storm rolling in." Besides, the woman's eyes glittered with something that wasn't quite kindness. "Where would you go? The nearest town is 40 meters north, and I'm afraid the trail can be quite treacherous in the dark, especially for a woman traveling alone." Clara's hand found the door handle, but when she tried to turn it, nothing happened. The metal wouldn't budge, as if it had been welded shut from the outside. Panic began to claw its way up her throat, but she forced herself to remain calm. Think, she told herself. There had to be a logical explanation. There had to be a way out. But as the chains in the corner rattled again, longer this time, more insistent, Clara began to understand that logic might not apply in this place. And worse yet, the three men at the table had begun to turn their heads toward her, their hollow eyes now filled with something that looked disturbingly like hunger. The hunger in their eyes wasn't what Clara had initially feared. It was worse. It was the desperate hunger of drowning men seeing a rope, the wild hope of the condemned hearing footsteps in the corridor. These men weren't looking at her with lust or violence. They were looking at her like salvation. Don't let their eagerness frighten you, the woman said, moving to light an oil lamp that cast dancing shadows across the walls. They're simply grateful for company. It's been some time since we've had a visitor. She paused, studying Clara's face with the intensity of someone appraising livestock, especially a woman. Clara forced herself to speak, though her voice came out stronger than she felt. How long have they been here? Oh, time moves differently out here. Does it really matter? The woman gestured dismissively. What matters is that you make your choice. Marcus there, she pointed to the dark-haired man with the scarred wrists, is quite gentle, excellent conversationalist when he's permitted to speak. Thomas, she indicated, the youngest of the three, a man who couldn't be more than 25, has wonderful hands, very skilled with delicate work. The way she emphasized certain words made Clara's stomach turn. She looked more carefully at Thomas and noticed his fingers were stained with what looked like ink. But the pattern was wrong, too dark, too permanent. When he shifted slightly in his chair, she caught sight of his arms. More scars, but these were different, precise, deliberate. And the third option? Clara asked, though she dreaded the answer. Ah, Benjamin, he's our strongest, very protective. Some women prefer that quality. The woman's smile never wavered, but there was something calculating in her gaze now. Though I must warn you, Benjamin has been here the longest. Sometimes the isolation affects men differently. Clara studied Benjamin, the third man at the table. Unlike the others, he didn't meet her eyes. His gaze remained fixed on his hands, which were folded so tightly his knuckles had gone white. There was something broken about his posture, something that spoke of a spirit worn down by months or perhaps years of whatever happened in this place. The chains rattled again from the corner, and this time Clara turned toward the sound. In the shifting lamplight, she could make out a massive figure hunched in the shadows. The Apache the woman had mentioned, even seated and bound. He was enormous, his shoulders broader than any man she'd ever seen. But unlike the men at the table, he was watching her, really watching her. And in his eyes she saw something that the others lacked: rage. I see you've noticed our special guest, the woman said, following Clara's gaze. He's not available for selection, I'm afraid. Too unpredictable, but he serves as an excellent reminder of what happens to those who don't. Follow the rules. The Apache's head turned slightly, and Clara caught sight of his face. One eye was swollen shut, dark purple spreading across his cheekbone like spilled wine. Fresh wounds. Recent punishment. What rules? Clara whispered. The woman's smile, finally, faltered just for a moment, revealing something cold and sharp underneath. The same rules that apply to everyone who stays here. Dear, you choose a man, you spend the evening together, and in the morning, well, we'll discuss the morning when it arrives. The way she said morning sent ice through Clara's veins because something in the woman's tone suggested that for many people, morning never came at all. And as if reading her thoughts, the Apache in the corner made a sound deep in his throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a word, but unmistakably a warning. Clara knew she needed time to think, to understand what she had stumbled into. but the woman seemed to sense her hesitation like a predator smelling fear. "Perhaps you'd like to refresh yourself before making your selection?" the woman offered, her voice dripping with false kindness. "There's a wash basin upstairs. Take all the time you need, dear. The men will wait." The way she said wait made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Clara nodded slowly, buying herself precious minutes to figure out how to escape this nightmare. As she moved toward the staircase, she noticed details that had escaped her initial panic. The windows were barred from the inside, heavy iron gratings that looked far too substantial for keeping animals out. They were meant to keep people in. The woman followed her partway up the stairs, her footsteps eerily silent on the wooden planks. "Oh, and Clara, dear," she called softly. Clara's blood went cold. She had never mentioned her name. "Do try to make your choice quickly. The men get restless when decisions are delayed, and restless men can be unpredictable." Alone in the small, upstairs room, Clara moved immediately to the single window. The bars were solid, welded in place, but between them she could see out into the yard. What she saw made her stomach drop. There were graves, dozens of them, small wooden crosses marking uneven mounds of earth that stretched back into the darkness like rows of teeth. Some looked fresh, the soil still dark and loose. Others had settled into the earth, claimed by time and weather, but it was what lay between the graves that truly terrified her. Personal belongings scattered in the dirt. A woman's boot too small to belong to any of the men downstairs. A torn piece of fabric that might have been a dress. A leather satchel with initials carved into the side that were definitely feminine. Clara was not the first woman to find herself in this place, and judging by those graves, she would not be the first to disappear. She moved away from the window, her mind racing. The wash basin sat on a small table, and beside it lay something that made her heart skip. A knife. Not large, just a small blade meant for paring fruit or mending clothes, but it was sharp and it was something. She slipped it into her boot, the metal cold against her ankle. Downstairs, she could hear the woman humming, a cheerful tune that sounded obscene in this house of horrors. But underneath the humming, Clara heard something else. Whispers. Low, urgent voices coming from the direction of the dining room. The men were talking, and they were being careful not to be overheard. She crept to the top of the stairs, straining to listen. Marcus was speaking, his voice barely audible. "New ones. Got fire in her, different from the others. Won't matter," came Benjamin's broken whisper. "They all end up the same way. Magnolia sees to that." "Maybe not," Thomas added, and there was something hopeful in his voice. "Did you see how she looked at the Apache? She's not scared like the others were. She's angry. Angry won't save her," Benjamin muttered. "Angry won't save any of us," but Marcus disagreed. "Angry might be exactly what we need. Question is, does she have the spine to do what needs doing?" Clara's hand instinctively moved to the knife in her boot. Whatever these men were planning, they were including her in it. And whatever was supposed to happen to her come morning, they were hoping she would fight back. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out what they had in mind, or foolish enough to trust men who were clearly as trapped as she was about to become. The decision was made for Clara when Magnolia's voice drifted up the stairs. "Sweet as poisoned honey. Time's up, dear. Your hosts are getting impatient." Clara descended slowly, her hand brushing against the knife in her boot for reassurance. The three men had shifted positions slightly, and she caught Marcus's eye for just a moment. He gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the corner where the Apache remained chained. It was subtle, but the message was clear. Pay attention to him. "I've decided," Clara announced, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I choose Marcus." Magnolia clapped her hands together with genuine delight. "Excellent choice, dear. Marcus is quite the gentleman." She moved behind his chair and placed both hands on his shoulders. "Aren't you Marcus?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied. But Clara noticed his jaw was clenched tight, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. "Wonderful. Now, Marcus will escort you to the guest room. It's quite comfortable. I assure you, you'll find everything you need for a pleasant evening together." Magnolia's smile was radiant, but her eyes remained cold as winter stones. "I do hope you'll both get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day." As Marcus stood, Clara saw him slip something from beneath his chair. Quick as a flash, he palmed the object and kept it hidden as he gestured for her to follow him. They moved toward a door at the back of the room, but as they passed the corner where the Apache sat, the massive man spoke for the first time. "Ayanna," he said, his voice deep and rough from disuse. It was just one word, but the way he said it made Clara stop. He wasn't speaking to her. He was telling her his name. Magnolia's smile faltered for the first time since Clara had arrived. "The Apache doesn't speak to guests," she said sharply. "He knows better than that." But Ayanna had already returned his gaze to the floor, and Clara saw something that made her blood run cold. Fresh blood on his knuckles and a new cut along his jaw. Whatever punishment he had received for speaking, it had been swift and brutal. Marcus's hand touched her elbow gently, guiding her toward the door. "This way," he murmured. But as they walked, Clara felt something pressed into her palm. Paper, folded tight and small. The guest room was Spartanly furnished but clean. A bed, a chair, a small table with a picture of water. Marcus closed the door behind them and immediately put his finger to his lips, pointing to the thin walls. Even here they were being watched, being listened to. He gestured for her to sit on the bed, then knelt as if to remove her boots. As his hands worked at the leather, he spoke in the barest whisper. "Magnolia drugs the evening meal, makes her guests compliant, easier to handle when morning comes." Clara's stomach dropped. What happens in the morning depends on whether you're useful. Marcus's hands stilled on her boot. Some women she keeps for a while. Others he didn't finish the sentence, but his eyes flicked toward the window, toward those graves Clara had seen. She unfolded the paper he had given her, keeping it low and hidden. It was a crude map of the house, with marks indicating where. Magnolia kept weapons, where the real keys to the doors were hidden, and most importantly, where she kept the key to Ayanna's chains. "Why him?" Clara whispered. Marcus's eyes met hers, and she saw desperation there that went bone deep. "Because he's the only one of us she's afraid of, and because he's the only one strong enough to break us all free." The plan was insane, dangerous, and likely to get them all killed. But as Clara stared at the map, thinking of those graves outside and the broken men downstairs, she realized it might be their only chance. The question was whether she had the courage to steal the key. Free a man who had every reason to hate anyone who looked like Magnolia, and trust that his desire for freedom outweighed his thirst for revenge. From downstairs came the sound of Magnolia humming again, that same cheerful tune. But now Clara could hear what lay beneath it. The sound of preparation, the clink of metal on glass, the scrape of something heavy being moved across the floor. Morning was still hours away, but Magnolia was already preparing for whatever ritual claimed the lives of women foolish enough to seek shelter in this house of horrors. Clara waited until Marcus's breathing became deep and regular, finding sleep beside her. The house had settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood and the distant sound of Magnolia moving about downstairs. According to the map, the keys were kept in a locked drawer in Magnolia's bedroom, which was directly below the guest room, moving with the careful precision of someone whose life depended on silence. Clara slipped from the bed. The floorboards were old, and she tested each step before putting her full weight down. Marcus had shown her which boards were loose, which ones would groan and give her away. She made it to the door without a sound. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by moonlight filtering through a single window. Magnolia's door was closed, and Clara could hear soft sounds from within, not quite snoring, but the heavy breathing of someone deep in sleep. She had one chance to get this right. The door handle turned without resistance, but Clara's heart nearly stopped when she saw the room. Magnolia wasn't alone. A fourth man lay chained to the bed, unconscious and clearly drugged. Unlike the others, this one was fresh, probably arrived within the last few days. His clothes were travel-worn, but not yet replaced with the clean garments Magnolia preferred for her collection. Clara understood now how Magnolia managed to control so many men. She drugged them, kept them weak and compliant, and used psychological torture to break their spirits. The ones downstairs had probably been here for months, maybe years, slowly losing pieces of themselves until resistance seemed impossible. The dresser sat against the far wall, and Clara moved toward it like a ghost. The locked drawer was exactly where Marcus had indicated, and she pulled out the small knife from her boot. The lock was old, probably as old as the house itself, and the blade slipped between the wood and metal with surprising ease. Inside the drawer was a collection that made her stomach turn. Personal effects from previous visitors, wedding rings, lockets, letters tied with ribbon, trophies from the women who had died here. But beneath the morbid collection, she found what she was looking for, a ring of keys. Each one labeled in Magnolia's precise handwriting. Kitchen, front door, back door, cellar, and finally the one that made her hands shake, Apache as her fingers closed around the keys. The man on the bed stirred, his eyes opened, unfocused and confused, and Clara saw him trying to process what he was seeing. A woman in his captor's room stealing something from the dresser. His mouth opened to speak, and Clara knew that if he made any sound, they were all dead. She moved quickly, pressing her hand over his mouth and leaning close to his ear. "I'm here to help," she whispered, barely breathing the words. "But you have to stay quiet. Can you do that?" He nodded, and she slowly removed her hand. His eyes were clearer now, focusing on her face with desperate hope. "How many others?" he managed to whisper. "4 men downstairs, 1 Apache in chains. We're going to get everyone out, but you have to stay quiet until I come back for you." She was halfway to the door when Magnolia's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Going somewhere, dear?" Clara spun around to find Magnolia standing in the doorway, fully dressed and holding something that glinted in the moonlight. Not a gun, but something worse. A syringe filled with clear liquid that Clara instinctively knew would rob her of consciousness, of choice, of any hope of escape. Magnolia stepped into the room with the calm confidence of someone who had played this scene before. "I must admit you're more resourceful than most. Usually they don't figure out the game until morning." She gestured with the syringe toward the chained man on the bed. Poor Harold here tried to run on his second night. Broke his leg in 3 places, falling from the window. Now he's much more cooperative. Clara's mind raced, calculating distances and possibilities. The keys were still clutched in her fist, and the knife was within reach in her boot. But Magnolia was between her and the door, and that syringe meant certain death, or worse, a fate like Harold's. "You know what fascinates me about women like you?" Magnolia continued, moving closer with predatory grace. "You think you're different, special, that somehow your situation will be the exception to the rule." She laughed, a sound like glass breaking. They all think that right up until the moment they realize how wrong they are. "Why?" Clara asked, genuinely trying to understand. "Why do this? Why collect people like trophies?" Magnolia's smile faltered. For just a moment, revealing something raw and hungry underneath. "Because I can. Because out here, 40 men are from anywhere that matters. I make the rules. I decide who lives, who dies, who suffers. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Do you have any idea what it's like to have that kind of power? To hold life and death in your hands like clay? Clara saw her chance. Magnolia was lost in her own monologue, drunk on her own sense of control. Clara lunged forward, not toward the door, but toward the window. She crashed through the glass in an explosion of sound and pain, feeling shards tear at her skin as she tumbled into the darkness outside. She hit the ground hard, her shoulder, taking the worst of the impact, but adrenaline carried her forward. Behind her, Magnolia was screaming, but not just in anger. There was fear in that voice now because Clara had done something unprecedented. She had escaped the room, and worse, she still had the keys. Clara ran toward the back of the house where she knew Ayanna was kept. The chains had been silent for too long, and she prayed he was still conscious, still strong enough to fight when the moment came. As she rounded the corner, she could see him in the moonlight. Massive and motionless, slumped against the wall of what looked like a reinforced shed. The key turned in the heavy lock with a solid click that seemed impossibly loud in the night air. Ayanna's head came up slowly, his one good eye focusing on her with an intensity that made her step back involuntarily. For a moment, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. This man was enormous, probably strong enough to kill her with his bare hands, and she had no guarantee that his desire for freedom was stronger than his rage. But then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of months or perhaps years of torment. You came back. It wasn't a question, it was recognition. And in that moment, Clara understood that Ayanna had been waiting for someone like her, someone foolish or desperate enough to try what everyone else had been too broken to attempt. The chains fell away from his wrists with a metallic crash that echoed across the night. Ayanna rose to his full height, towering over Clara like a force of nature unleashed. From inside the house came the sound of Magnolia rallying her remaining captives, her voice sharp with commands and threats. But it was too late for threats. Ayanna was free, and his smile in the moonlight was the most terrifying thing Clara had ever seen. Ayanna moved toward the house with the silent grace of a predator, and Clara struggled to keep up with his long strides. Up close, she could see the full extent of what Magnolia had done to him. Scars crisscrossed his back and arms, some old and silvered, others fresh and still healing. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Whatever spirit Magnolia had tried to break was not only intact, but burning with a fury that had been carefully banked and fed for however long he had been captive. The front door stood open, spilling yellow light into the darkness. Magnolia's voice carried from inside, sharp with panic as she barked orders to her remaining captives. Find her. She can't have gone far with those injuries. And if any of you even think about helping her, remember what happened to the last one who tried to be a hero. Ayanna paused at the doorway, his massive frame filling the entrance completely. Magnolia, he called, his voice carrying the weight of stone grinding against stone. It's time. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as footsteps approached from inside the house. When Magnolia appeared, she was no longer the composed mistress of the house. Her hair was disheveled, her dress torn, where she had apparently tried to follow Clara through the window, but most tellingly her hands were shaking. You, she whispered, her voice cracking. You can't be free. I have the only key. Ayanna held up his hands, showing the broken chain link still attached to his wrist like brutal jewelry. Keys break, chains break, people break too. Magnolia, you taught me that. Behind Magnolia, Clara could see the other men emerging from the shadows. Marcus was there, and Thomas and Benjamin, but something had changed in them. The hollow emptiness was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. Harold must have spread the word of Clara's attempt because they moved with purpose, now positioning themselves between Magnolia and any possible escape route. This is my house, Magnolia said. but her voice lacked its earlier authority. "These are my rules. You can't just—" "Your rules died the moment you chained the first person in this house," Ayanna interrupted. "How many, Magnolia? How many people have you destroyed for your amusement?" Clara watched as Magnolia's composure crumbled completely. The mask of refined control slipped away, revealing something desperate and small underneath. "I gave them purpose," she insisted. "I gave them meaning. Without me, they were nothing. They drifters, nobodies, people the world had already forgotten." "You gave them hell," Marcus said quietly, speaking for the first time since Clara had known him. "And you convinced yourself it was kindness." Magnolia's eyes darted around the room, looking for any avenue of escape, any way to regain control of the situation. But she was outnumbered now, and more importantly, she was no longer dealing with broken people. Clara's act of defiance had reminded them all of something they had almost forgotten. They had choices. Ayanna stepped closer, and Magnolia backed against the wall. "Please," she whispered. "I can give you anything, money, supplies, safe passage, whatever you want." "I want justice," Ayanna said simply. "For everyone who died here, for everyone who suffered because of your games." Clara realized she was holding her breath, waiting to see what form that justice would take, because in Ayanna's eyes, she could see the same cold fury that had probably lived in Magnolia's heart all these years. The question was whether freedom would break the cycle of cruelty or simply change who held the power to inflict it. The justice Ayanna chose was not the brutal vengeance Clara Ara had feared. Instead, he bound Magnolia with her own chains, the same heavy links that had held him prisoner for what he later revealed had been 8 months of torment. She sat in the corner where he had suffered, experiencing for the first time the weight of metal around her wrists, the helplessness of being completely at someone else's mercy. "We could kill you," Ayanna said, his voice matter-of-fact. "After what you've done, no one would blame us. But death would be too quick, too clean for someone who made suffering into an art form." Marcus had found the keys to the front door, and one by one the other captives gathered what few possessions they had. Harold, still weak from whatever drug Magnolia had been giving him, leaned heavily on Thomas as they prepared to leave. Benjamin moved like a man waking from a long nightmare, touching the door frame as if he couldn't quite believe he was free to walk through it. "The nearest town is 40 miar north," Clara said, addressing the group. "If we travel together, help each other, we can make it by tomorrow evening." But Ayanna shook his head. "You go with them. Make sure they reach safety. I have something else to finish here." Clara understood. The graves. All those women who had died in this place deserved more than unmarked mounds of earth. Someone needed to stay to give them proper burials to make. Sure, their deaths were not forgotten. What about her? Clara gestured toward Magnolia, who was testing the strength of her chains with the same desperate futility her victims had shown. "She'll face justice. Real justice. When I reach town, I'll bring back the territorial marshal. Let her explain to proper authorities how all those graves came to be in her yard." Ayanna's expression was grim but satisfied. "She'll have plenty of time to think about her choices while she waits." Clara gathered her things, including the small knife that had started her rebellion. As she prepared to leave, Magnolia spoke for the last time, her voice small and broken. "You don't understand. I saved them. I gave them purpose, structure, meaning you gave them hell," Clara replied, echoing Marcus's earlier words, and called it hospitality. The journey to town took 16 hours of hard travel, but they reached civilization as the sun was setting the following day. Harold was taken to a doctor. Marcus and Thomas found work at the local stable, and Benjamin, after a bath and a proper meal, began talking about heading east to find family he hadn't seen in years. 3 days later, Ayanna arrived with the territorial marshal and 2 deputies. What they found at Magnolia's ranch sent shockwaves through the territory. 27 graves. Personal effects from dozens of victims and detailed journals where Magnolia had documented her crimes with the clinical precision of someone who believed she was conducting important research into human nature. Magnolia Voss was tried for multiple counts of murder and sentenced to hang. She showed no remorse during the trial, maintaining until the end that she had been providing a service to society by giving purpose to people who would otherwise have lived meaningless lives. Clara never attended the trial. By the time it began, she was already 50 memoirs south, continuing the journey that had been interrupted by her night at the ranch. But she was changed by the experience, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demand it. She also carried something else. The certainty that evil often wears a pleasant face and offers comfortable beds to weary travelers. But she had learned that even in the darkest places, even when hope seems lost, there are always choices. And sometimes those choices can set not just yourself free, but everyone around you. The knife stayed in her boot for the rest of her travels, a reminder that survival sometimes requires sharp edges, whether made of steel or will. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable story where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to